Get ready to enter a brave new world with your host, Vasant Dhar.
Brave New World is supported by the Center for Data Science, or CDS, at NYU. If your organization is interested in engaging with CDS through student projects, please email cdsindustry@nyu.edu. Hello, and welcome to a new season of Brave New World. For more color on the podcast and additional commentary, please subscribe to my newsletter at vasantdhar.substack.com. My guest today is Shelley Stewart, who's a senior partner at McKinsey, where he's director for the McKinsey Institute for Black Economic Mobility. It's a think and do tank focused on catalyzing cross-sector action to build a more inclusive, dynamic economy. I like the do tank part. We've got plenty of think tanks, but not enough do tanks. We're going to talk about the motivation behind the Institute, what it's done so far, and the challenges that lie ahead in terms of fostering mobility and opportunity for all. I'm going to pick his brain about how COVID has changed the nature of work and how data and tech is changing the advisory business. And if you have time, I'm going to talk to him about what the hell the metaverse is all about and where it's going. Shelley, welcome to Brave New World. I am delighted to have you on the show.
Vasant, thank you very much for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
So where are you on this hot day?
Yeah, it is incredibly hot, breaking records all over the place. Just got back from the road this morning, and I'm in my home office in Bedford-Stuyvesant in Brooklyn.
Yeah, I'm a little bit north of the city. I just got back last week from Provence, where I had an amazing holiday, but I was rewarded with COVID on the flight back from Paris. So the last week has been recovery, but thankfully it hasn't been debilitating. And I think I'm hopeful I don't have a brain fog, but we'll see as we go along.
Now, you look well for someone that's just recovered. And you sound sharp. So hopefully you won't have any issues. But I think you are one of many people I talk to on a daily basis now, unfortunately, that seem to be having run-ins with this latest variant. But so hopefully that we get past that.
Yeah, I know. I think we're just so exhausted, and sort of we let our guard down. I've gone 2.5 years without contacting it, and I was just boasting to someone how I've barely gotten sick these last 2.5 years because I wash my hands a lot. I've been really careful, and boom,
right.
Before you know it, there you are. So, Shelley, great to have you. Before we launch into sort of the businessy aspect of our conversation, just tell us a little bit about, what your journey has been and how you got to your current role at McKinsey. Yeah,
well, I'd love to portray it as a straight line journey, but that only the highlight reel looks that way. It's been an exciting but oftentimes zigzaggy journey, if you will. So look, academically, I studied economics, so I've got a BA in economics. I've also got an MBA in finance and business and an MPA as well in political economy. So academically, I've kind of done the couple of grad school thing, and that was kind of in the middle of a career pivot. I started out of undergrad at JP Morgan in their global markets business. I mean, it was a fantastic place to start your career. Great structure around how they trained us, committed people that developed us and taught us the tools of the trade. And being in global markets when you're right out of undergrad, it gave a practical application to the economics I had studied in undergrad. Really helped to bring it into sharp focus, and being around fixed income and rates and credit and FX. It was really a fascinating experience. I think that really bolstered my understanding of the way the economy and global markets work. And so that was a great experience. And then I, after grad school, pivoted to management consulting. And I've been at McKinsey for the last 10 years. On the personal side, married to my wife, Rochelle, and we have 2 young sons, Shelley the fourth and Ellis.
How old are they?
So Shelley is 2.5 and Ellis is 6 months. So
okay.
both born during COVID. And so interesting world to be born into, but practically what that's meant for me is that I've gotten to be a lot closer and home a lot more in a profession that generally implies a lot more travel in normal time. So a little bit of the silver lining there for me.
Yeah, no, it's sort of a crazy time. My neighbor has a 4-year-old now, and I guess most of that growing up experience has been during COVID. So you wonder what sort of how these kids are going to grow up, right? Their perception of sort of germs and contact and all that stuff so much different from what it used to be.
Absolutely. I took my son Shelley to get his vaccine now that it's approved for kids younger than 5, and we were in the car and I said, "Hey, we're going to go get our COVID vaccine," and he said, "Yay!" And he was thinking that it's a COVID test because he actually likes now. He's gotten so many of them. He thinks that that's part of the game, the COVID test.
Yeah.
Needless to say, the COVID shot was a little bit of a surprise when he got the vaccine, that it wasn't as pleasant maybe as he was hoping, but a lollipop shortly thereafter got him back to a calm and normal state. So,
yeah, so Shelley, let's talk about what you're doing at McKinsey, which sounds really interesting. I've read several of your reports, and you have this McKinsey Institute for Black Economic Mobility, and what I took away from it is that the vision or the high level goal is to improve racial and economic inequalities in communities around the world. So tell us more about that. Like, how are you going about doing this? And, what kind of sort of actionable insights have emerged from your work at this institute? Perhaps start with why COVID has been especially bad for the Black community.
Maybe let me talk a little bit about the bridge between COVID-19 and how we got to forming this institute and really accelerating the work that we had started actually in earnest before COVID-19. There's no doubt that COVID as a pandemic and as an exogenous shock to our daily lives has been devastating to the Black community. And I think in some ways I'm gonna paint a bit of a picture for why it, I think, is a double-edged sword with maybe a bit of a bitter silver lining. We know that lives and livelihoods have been challenged all around the world with respect to COVID-19. We also know, and by the way, it should come as no surprise, and even though when it was being reported in 2020, it felt like some folks were genuinely surprised that the pandemic was hitting certain communities harder, both in terms of livelihoods and lives. But again, it shouldn't have been a surprise because we know from history, we know from intuition that the closer you live to the poverty line, the more you tend to be impacted by these events disproportionately. And so that is really, that really accelerated our focus on Black economic mobility. We being myself and a few colleagues who had already been doing research on the concept of the wealth gap that exists between Black Americans and other groups. And so we had started that research, but COVID we got really worried in April of 2020 that people weren't talking about the fact that certain communities were even more vulnerable than the general population. And so that obviously got us thinking, and we put out a piece called COVID-19 Investing in Black Lives and Livelihoods. And then
why is that? Why was the Black community disproportionately impacted? Is it because they were sort of more on the front lines in terms of service kinds of roles? Like, what were the factors that led to this disproportionately high impact on them?
So let me hit them separately. Let me start with the livelihood piece, and then I'll come to the lives piece. But underneath both of these is, frankly, the proximity to the poverty line and the proportion of Black Americans that are poor. And so if I take the livelihood side, there's a couple of things that are going on. You hit on one of them. One of them is Black Americans are and remain more likely to be in frontline and what we deemed during the pandemic essential worker roles. And therefore, when many of us had the ability to quarantine, turn the Zoom on and work remotely, these folks were out in the world doing things that allowed us to survive and maintain, whether they be things in the food chain or things in the hospital system like nursing. And so just more exposed to the virus, right? And so I think that's kind of one piece of it, is that work dynamic on the livelihood side. And that has to do with Black Americans occupying the kind of entry level rung at disproportionate rates and lower paying jobs that tend to have less benefits. And so that's kind of one piece of it. Another piece of it is actually on the business ownership side, which also links back to capital. If you look at the different sectors that Black-owned businesses are in relative to the business pie as a whole, they tend to be in sectors that were more impacted by COVID-19. And often that's because, frankly, capital constraints on the front end cause a certain amount of down selection into certain industries. And so there's a whole bunch of stuff that have to do with the wealth endowment or lack thereof and the types of jobs that Black Americans are in. If I then think about the live side, which is certainly the most important side, there's all sorts of things that you can discuss to get your head around why Black Americans will be disproportionately impacted. So if you think about the housing conditions, particularly in urban areas, like the close proximity, the inability to avoid others because of the density of where you live, I think it's been well documented that there's the comorbid conditions that are more prevalent in Black Americans, which link to poverty levels and lack of the lack of fresh food that's in 8.2 million Black Americans live in USDA defined food deserts. So there's all sorts of stuff going on in these communities. And this is not about being genetically predisposed. I want to be clear, right? But this is about conditions where people live and the amount of income and wealth they have and the access to healthcare that make them more vulnerable. And so both sides of this just create a bit of a perfect storm in the context of a pandemic.
I think you summarized that really well. The various factors that made them more vulnerable. I can imagine that it's been, quite a challenge to get the data associated with, these factors and the impact. What kinds of insights have emerged? I mean, what can we do to make things better or lessen the impact of COVID?
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly the essence of why we formed the Institute. And the one other moment I want to lift up that kind of came in parallel, which I think many of us believe is inextricably linked with, or the response to it is inextricably linked with COVID, is the murder of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and many others. The fact that happened in the context of the pause that was COVID, it brought these injustices in a very, very, very sharp focus. And so what have we seen in turn? I think we've actually now seen a multitude of commitments and discussions about reform that otherwise may not have been surfaced if one of those things happened on their own. And so to me, there is a bit of silver lining, which gets me to the Institute and what it is and how we use data to bring insights and solutions to bear. So we formed this Institute in the context of those two big events, or I guess COVID, and then the broader dialogue that accelerated around injustice with respect to encounters between Black Americans and law enforcement. And myself and some colleagues said, well, what is it that McKinsey could add to this discussion? Right? We don't do policy, we don't do politics, we don't do criminal justice reform. We do have a big healthcare practice, but how do we bring some of this stuff together in a way that's unique to McKinsey? And we said, let's just take the same approach that we take to any area that we intend to have impact on. Right? Let's first start with developing a fact base and insights that we can then use to go have a series of conversations with people in our broad ecosystem and network. I mean, we are privileged to sit in a position where we are partners and advisors to private sector companies, to governments, to the largest foundations. And so it uniquely situates us to bring together a set of insights with people that can truly influence change on something that I believe is one of the greatest challenges of our generation, prior generation, and I think even for the next generation. And so we formed the Institute to develop insights, to foster a dialogue, but then to move actually to action with different partners across different parts of the ecosystem to try to help address these issues. And so if I think about, as we thought about some of the different insights that have emerged, I think they happen on a few different. There's a few different dimensions that I'll give you. So we took this look at Americans as economic participants, and we said, what are the different ways people interact with the economy? And we came up with this role framework. So people are workers, they're business owners, they're consumers, they're savers and investors, and they're residents who live in places and pay taxes and use public goods and services. And so then we started to think, if you plug in Black Americans in each of those roles, and you look at the different levels of economic participation for Black Americans versus other groups, where does it tell you that there are big opportunities? And then from that, what are the solutions to help address those opportunities? So, for example, we did extensive work on Black Americans in their role as workers, and we found a more than $200 billion wage gap. And I'm defining gap as if Black Americans had their fair share, age adjusted, of the income pie, how much income would be coming into the community? And then you dissect it and say, well, what's driving that, right? It's a mix of sector, geography, where you are, you're overrepresented in entry level versus executive. And then you can start to have a dialogue with the private sector, frankly, about what is it that we can do to help address this challenge that we have found on the wage side, for example. Similar analysis holds when you look at business ownership and entrepreneurship. There's a huge gap. If Black Americans had their fair share of the revenue pie of small and medium businesses, there'd be another order of magnitude higher in terms of the revenues that would be flowing and the wealth that would be created in the Black community. Why is it? Well, there's a sector piece. There's also a geography piece. There's a capitalization and scaling piece. And so really trying to go role by role and say, what is the gap and what is the source? Why does it exist? And who are the best actors to help address that from a private sector perspective? And then also thinking about the role of the government and the role of the social sector.
So this sounds like a humongous data exercise, isn't it? By data exercise, I mean not just integrating existing databases. I also mean making decisions about what new data to collect in order to answer these larger questions around the opportunity gaps that you've described, and then how to address them. Where are you in this journey of creating the data that you need?
I think we're still in the early days, as you probably are well aware, given your background, Vasant. This requires not just pulling existing raw data extracts, but it's a canvassing of all the things that are out there today. There's another element, which is creating new data sets, for example, going out and surveying the population to gather certain insights. And then oftentimes, and we have our own data science team that sits inside the Institute, then stitching together these data sets in a way that allows you to come up with new insights. And so we are in the second or third inning of doing this for the Black community in the U.S. We're also doing some of this similar work for the Hispanic Latinx community in the U.S. and really trying to pull together a single source of truth so that people who want to have impact on these issues don't need to go invest a year to build the data. If a bank wants to do something on the small business side, we want to be able to say, here are the insights in the data in terms of the opportunities. It's in this part of the country. Here's the number of businesses that are owned today. Here's the industry here's where we need capital to flow if we want to try to unstick some of these entrepreneurs who want to scale and grow businesses in these industries that are growing fast. And so that's really the core point on the data side, is how do we do it centrally and create assets that allow other stakeholders to move with speed towards solutions. And so that's really what we're working towards.
So are there things about McKinsey that make it somewhat uniquely situated to do this kind of research, right? That where you're able to sort of leverage the expertise from your advisory business, historically, that kind of positions you sort of uniquely well to do something like this?
I think there's probably three things that position us well, and there are many others who are doing this important work in the social sector, as well as other private sector entities that have groups that are doing this. But I think there are three things that situate us quite well to help lead this. One is our extensive network of clients and relationships, whether it be in the banking sector, which has a huge role to play here, or in the foundation sector, or in the state and local government sector. We've got extensive relationships to draw on as we are designing and thinking about the questions that would be most helpful to answer. And so that's one. I think we are very, very unique in the breadth and depth of those relationships. The second thing is we've got McKinsey colleagues that have expertise in all these different areas, right? We have thousands and thousands of consultants in the US. And so we can draw on deep internal knowledge to help push our thinking and make sure that we're looking at the various areas holistically and with the best experts on education, or again, on banking, or on helping to think about this food desert issue. And so we draw on the collective the collective expertise of the firm and of our colleagues. And then three, I know folks don't think of us as a tech company, but in many ways we are fast on the path of being a tech company. I mean, we've made a number of acquisitions to help up our capabilities around data science, around AI, machine learning, cloud. So we've got data engineers, data scientists. We've got a set of colleagues that we can bring to bear on this that McKinsey didn't have 10 years ago. But you put that together with the depth of our client network, the depth of expertise, and it situates us quite well to move this whole discussion forward.
Very interesting. I was an advisor to McKinsey some 7 or 8 years ago when it was in the process of building out its data and AI capability. And I noted the several data and tech-related acquisitions by the company after that. I was struck at the time at how the advisory business was changing with the ascendance of evidence-based analysis in the advisory business, where data now plays a central role. Reminds me of this quote, "In God we trust, everyone else, please bring data."
Yeah, no, it plays a huge role. Our clients are becoming more and more sophisticated in recognizing the need for data. We have a large and rapidly growing data and analytics practice we call DNA. My strong hypothesis is that that sometime in the not too distant future, we may not even have a DNA practice because digital and analytics will be so deeply embedded into everything else we do. You can't have a conversation about building out marketing and sales capabilities and not be talking about digital and analytics. And you could say the same thing about strategy and corporate finance or procurement and operations. And so I think it's just a broader trend in business, and it's only something that we see accelerating. And from my perspective, if I go back to this topic of Black economic mobility, these capabilities we wouldn't be able to have the impact that we're having if we didn't have these capabilities. And there's a lot of interesting stuff you can do with data. You can get people focused on the biggest gaps and biggest opportunities. You can also debunk stereotypes and myths that may actually be holding progress back. Let me give you a few examples of those that have surfaced in the data. There's this sometimes used stereotype that the issue with Black Americans and mobility, or one of the issues, is financial literacy, literally financial acumen, and a lack of desire and willingness to save, just spending money on things that are luxuries and just consumption for consumption's sake. The data doesn't prove that out. The data actually shows us that Black Americans actually tend to be more frugal at each income level than other segments of the population. And the issue is one of income. That the issue is that the incomes are so burdened that there's not anything left to save. So I think that's one example. Another one that came out recently in some work that we did was this desire for healthier food options. Right? It shows up in the population as a whole if you look at trends around food consumption, but it actually shows up as being disproportionately desired and preferred by the Black community in a survey that we ran recently, in a comprehensive survey. And that could be because of one of two things. It could be that actually the population desires it more. It could also be a reflection of the fact that some segments of the population have the luxury to take as a given that they will have healthy food options. And so it doesn't show up as strongly in the preference because it doesn't need to show up. That it's not there exactly. And so I mean, things like this, maybe one other, we think about attitudinal segments as being core to delivering on any consumer business that requires a tailored value proposition. And we recently did a segmentation analysis on the Black population in the U.S. And we actually found seven statistically distinct segments. So seven different sets of preferences. And what was interesting is when we did the same analysis on the population as a whole, we could only actually find 5. And so when you looked at the Black population, you actually found more granularity and more variety. And so if you think about the implications for that, if you are just using this 5-segment view of the world, you may miss an opportunity to really disproportionately delight and serve some segments of the Black population that could turn out to be a loyal customer base and all these different things, and product design and marketing and customer experience, all these things you can do once you understand the attitudes and preferences. And so all that to say that there's that using data in this way is unlocking new ways of thinking about not just the problems and opportunities, but also the solutions.
Seems to me that now is the golden age for economics and sociology because of all the data that's become available and makes the nuanced insights that you're talking about possible.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really, really important and interesting push. I think the economic, and I'm by no means an economist, although I stumbled through it in undergrad, stumbled through it again in business school, and even took some in policy school. But what I would say is, I think the framework and the mental models, which are stylized and simplified, I think are helpful in giving you a conceptual understanding of the way the economy works, to some extent, the way markets work. But I do agree with you, practically speaking, that as you talk about policy and you're trying to build models for how complex different systems interact to create a set of outcomes, I do think we need to be much more data-driven and much more analytically focused. And I think one of the things that I would just add here is the work that we're leading is not just about Black Americans. I mean, in many ways, Black Americans are the tip of the spear, if you will, for a broader issue we have, at least in America, but also in other countries around the world, of a slowing of economic mobility. And I just saw a post from our global managing partner today that said 7 in 10 people globally live in a place where wealth inequality is growing. I don't, and McKinsey doesn't think that is sustainable. And I mean, it actually, the nature of that actually we believe will undermine growth in the long term. And personally, I also, I read a lot of the social science literature about this, and I think it also undermines openness, tolerance, political stability. Right? If you have large swaths of the population that do not feel optimistic about theirs or their children or the next generation's future, that has really, 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 really negative implications often for how they view a lot of things that are important to the stability of the economy and to the stability of the political system. And so I think all that to say, we do need now to not rely on dogma and theoretical understanding of things, and really think about and model out using data, what are the things that are going to drive sustainable, inclusive growth, broad-based economic prosperity. And I think that's one of the most urgent imperatives. And so our work on Black Americans is saying, well, Black Americans happen to be in the US, the group that experiences, or one of the groups that experiences the least amount of economic mobility. But the solutions that we're looking at there are much more broadly applicable to the vast majority, frankly, of folks who are not who are feeling quite cynical about the American dream and the opportunity to move forward.
Yeah, Shelley, it's fascinating. This reminds me of a conversation I just had with the new dean of the business school at Oxford University. And he's done a lot of research on sort of global innovation and what makes some countries more innovative than others, and sort of the inequality of sort of innovation and various other things. And we were talking about how business schools have changed in the last 10 or 20 years, right? Where things like inclusiveness, inequality, and ethics were kind of afterthoughts. You focused on sort of profit maximization and shareholder value. And he talked about the fact that sort of business schools have sort of now grown up at a different phase in our life. We're sort of reflecting more broadly about the state of the world. Do you see the same thing happening in business and the advisory business? Like, how has McKinsey changed in the last 10 years? What's different now than used to be when you started?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And I actually participated in a discussion this year at Davos that was hosted by the Financial Times and a number of business school deans on exactly this topic, this notion of the role of business in a changing world, and the role of the individual corporation. And I do think we're at a bit of an inflection point, which I'm not sure which direction that we will go in, but this conversation about stakeholder capitalism, multi-stakeholder capitalism, versus a more simplified view of corporations as profit maximizing entity on behalf of shareholders. And what I am seeing, and it's too early to tell what the outcome is going to be, is significantly more discussion about what is our responsibility, yes, to shareholders, but also to employees, also to the environment, also to our customers. And some of those things will almost by definition be in conflict. And so I think we're trying to work out mental models and ways to think about that conflict, but at least we're having that discussion. I personally think it starts with the time frame in which we're optimizing. I think we have to move, particularly in the context of business, away from the shorter duration quarterly view of things to a longer view. And I actually think if you take the longer view, then those things are not as in conflict. So I have often thought about the conflict as being just the function of the time period you're looking at. Because over the long run, if you don't foster and create an environment that's exciting for employees, where they're inspired and want to come to work, and there's some level of stability, low turnover. If you're not optimizing to ensure that the environmental impact of your business is not creating a situation that's unsustainable in the future for your business, right? Of course, and optimizing profit for share or making sufficient profit for shareholders such that you have the capital you need to grow. If you're not doing all of those things to some degree over the long run, then you don't have a successful business. And so I think part of it starts with the time frame. And in terms of McKinsey, I think this is absolutely shifting the way we approach being impact partners with our clients. We have moved recently to this notion of a holistic impact framework. So whereas the old world, we might talk about the financial impact of a given effort, that we support a client on. Like, we worked with this client to scale their revenue and EBITDA over 5 years to be X. And that was 95% of the focus, or 90% with some capability building added to that. We trained up X number of employees, to now saying, if we look across all the different ways we can have impact when working with a client, are we living up to that bar of holistic impact? And so I hope that we can be instrumental in accelerating this discussion with our clients. Again, it's still early days, but it's not accidental that the way we're describing what our mission is as a firm is to create sustainable, inclusive growth. All those words are very, very deliberate. And so that's the way that we're thinking about our role.
So do you think that markets are also evolving to reward that kind of long-term behavior, right? Because that's always been the tension, right? That markets sort of, reward, you have this quarterly earnings, and that's what markets focus on. So are you seeing that markets are giving companies sort of a longer leash and focusing sort of on inclusive growth, that in the long run, that'll lead to sort of greater prosperity for everyone? Or is that too much to hope for?
No, but I think you're right. I think at some point in time, there has to be some recognition by markets, by the sources of capital, or else it doesn't work. I think we are seeing a gradual evolution. I don't think all participants in markets are going to move. I think you will still have some parts of the capital markets ecosystem that focus on a different set of things. But one potential indication that we are moving in this direction is you're seeing a lot of the big public money pension funds, right, who are often LPs in hedge funds and private equity funds and VC, asking a different set of questions, right? Expecting there to be ESG diligence as well as financial diligence when you go purchase some asset. And so I do think you see some of the, what I used to call my old days, real money players asking a different set of questions. And it's too early to know how widespread the adoption will be. But I hope that it happens faster, not slower, because I think it is critical to the political stability that's required to continue to do all the things that all of us want to do. And so I do think that there's a great imperative for capital to catch up. And I think you're starting to see some of it.
You stole the acronym ESG right out of my mouth. I was going to ask you, how prevalent is that in conversations these days? Is it real? Is it a buzzword? Is the measurement of it real? Is the measurement of it gamed? Because in the early days of ESG, some people claimed, well, ESG companies are more profitable, they're more successful. And I looked at the data and I didn't see any evidence for that. It was sort of wishful thinking. But where are we now in terms of ESG? Like, how much are you hearing it, and how real is it? And what about the measurement of it?
So if I decompose the E, the S, and the G, and I know I'm not as close on the G side of it. But if I start with the E, I would say we have made tremendous progress. We collectively, the business community, some extent the public sector, social sector, on bringing the E into very, very sharp focus to well down the road of, as you know, of unified standards and different ways to think about and measure. And it is a topic of conversation in every client situation that I'm involved in. The E piece of it, whether it's carbon reduction or green business building, right? Building businesses that are green and using that as a competitive advantage when competing in the market. That is everywhere, and that I think is I wouldn't call it mature, but there are very few sectors where we are not having conversations on sustainability and on the E, and it's very real. And companies have invested in bringing talent in house, and we've invested to build expertise and tools and solutions. So I think that's very, very real. We also made an acquisition in that space a couple of years back. On the S, we are early days. We are very, 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 very early days. The S has many components to it. I think the one that is the most mature is companies having some view of the diversity or lack of diversity in their workforce, right, across the funnel. That is kind of the traditional diversity, equity, and inclusion lens. I think that one is pretty mature. Most places are measuring it and releasing, in the US at least, through their EEO1 data, they're releasing something about that if they're publicly traded. And so that one is mature, but then all the other aspects of the S are a lot more nascent and a lot less well defined. And part of what we've been doing is trying to help define some of that. And I think the Business Roundtable formed a subcommittee on racial equity that was chaired by Jamie Dimon and Robert Smith. I think they helped to move this along by bringing together leading institutions to kind of develop a frame around this and move some of these things forward. So I think we are more mature on the E, still early days on the S. I don't feel like we're at a point where things are going to slow or turn back. I think they're going to accelerate on both dimensions.
So what are the big sort of research questions that would be interesting to answer in the E and the S space, right? For academics or for PhD students, people getting engaged in research in this area. What would be sort of the 2 or 3 big research questions that people should focus on?
I'll defer to my colleagues on the E who have much more experience on that one. I think on the S, there are a few things that I think would be very, very interesting, and we've answered them to some degree, but I think more work should be done. I think the first is, what is the role of business ownership in diverse or underserved communities in wealth creation? Not like does it create wealth, but getting sharper on how much income and wealth does it actually create in these communities if you get it right, and with that, how much capital is actually needed to achieve that outcome. I think that's kind of one big question. I think there's another research question, which is around talent and what would it, if you look at the future of work and which is like a term that we've been using at McKinsey to describe the jobs of the future and the loss of a certain set of jobs that exist today because of automation. If you think about that, what's the magnitude of investment that we require, particularly in groups that are already lagging behind, to one, just keep those groups neutral in the future of work, but then two, to actually, in some world, get them to accelerate up the curve with this new, with the changes in the job composition that are pending, right? Because one of the things that we found in some early research we did is the future of work right now is a massive headwind for the Black community. So if you're already behind today, it is only going to get significantly worse because of educational inequity, because of the jobs that are held today that are higher risk of automation, for example, truck driving. And so I think some work to be done around both what's going to happen and what's the investment required to either maintain, but then hopefully maybe even get to something that feels more like parity.
Really interesting, this whole sort of future of work and how it's changing. How has work changed at McKinsey in the last few years? And has the change that's been sort of driven by COVID, is this here to stay? The more people I talk to, it seems to me that we're not going back to the old way of doing things.
Yeah, so I think we don't know yet, and there's lots of different forces at play. And I sat in a discussion with some North American CEOs on this very topic, and there was very, very, very heavy disagreement and strong feelings in all different directions. Like everything from everybody needs to be in person every day because we're going to lose our competitive advantage if it's not that way, to no, I think 95% of the people can be remote 95% of the time and actually will be more productive, and everything in between. So I don't know. I think we're still learning as things recede. My personal view of, as I watch kind of what's happening at McKinsey, is I think on balance, there is an opportunity to retain some aspects of this hybrid model. I think the notion of being more selective and deliberate about when we travel or when we co-locate has incredibly can be incredibly beneficial to individuals' health, family life, etc., as well as to the environment, right? So I think we have to be responsible to employees and to the environment. I think we have to seriously consider what aspects stay. I do think that there is no substitute for in-person in certain moments, right? I've heard them called moments that matter, and those moments depend on the business you're in and so on. I went to a dinner last night. I flew down for the night down to North Carolina. And yes, you might argue that going down for a couple of hours is one of those things that we should get rid of in the new hybrid world. But going to a dinner and sitting with clients who are also friends you haven't seen and sometimes unlocks a different set of conversations. And so I think we've got to try to thread this needle. And I don't think hybrid means just Zooms. I think we've got to actually rethink and get creative around, if people are not co-located, the answer isn't just Zoom. What else? What are the other collaboration tools? Because part of what I get frustrated is if people say, oh, well, remote doesn't work because I'm so tired of sitting on Zooms all day. Well, that's because Zoom is not really hybrid. Zoom is just like a bit of a Band-Aid for in-person. What if we reimagined and redesign the way we collaborate when we're not co-located? And so I think that is a bigger challenge.
This reminds me of a conversation I had with Jeff Teper from Microsoft, who is, in charge of collaborative tools, right? And, we were talking about the fact that the tools at the moment are relatively primitive, but they're evolving. Okay? And I can just sort of imagine, an Isaac Asimov kind of a future where you can't tell the difference, right? And in that type of environment, how you interact with people completely changes. But I was fascinated by your point that there was certain, you went down to North Carolina for a few hours, and I can imagine there's certain moments where you just have to be there in person, right? You want to close the deal or have a conversation of a certain type with a bunch of people in close proximity. It's much harder to do that at the moment with the state of the art that we have. On the other hand, I've seen, in my profession, for example, people actually oftentimes prefer the virtual format to the in-person because you'll only get 20 or 30 people in person, whereas you can get hundreds of people just sort of tune in, and zoom in for a session. And it's so much more effective, so much more efficient. So, there's little wonder that there's so much disagreement among the group of CEOs that you talked about, because it just depends on which part of the elephant they're touching, isn't it?
That's right. No, that's absolutely right. Which actually brings me to another interesting point around the future and what we learned during COVID. That is the pace that we can get things done. So even if you think about this challenge of going from the primitive state of collaborative tools to the 2 and 3.0 version, is much shorter than we thought pre-COVID. We worked with clients to do things that they had been trying to do previously for 2 years, and they were able to get them done in 2 weeks because they had no option. And so one of the biggest takeaways for us, and it is fundamentally changing the way we engage with our clients and shape our own and their aspiration, is the speed of actual innovation. I mean, just take the biggest example, which is vaccines. I mean, just think about the timeline versus the status quo before COVID. And so one of the things that we're walking away with is, how do we work with organizations to be incredibly more agile and do stuff that they previously would have said, you'd write this long Gantt chart with all these activities for 2 years, and say, how do we do that in 2 months? And so I do think that that's another interesting potential implication of a post-COVID world, whatever that looks like.
Yeah, fascinating. This whole area of the future of work, I think, is a very fruitful area for research. So, Shelley, I want to sort of turn the conversation sort of in a slightly different direction towards students who are a big part of my life, and employment that they seek. And your organization is one of those sort of things that many of them aspire to. What advice would you have for them in terms of how to sort of think about working for an organization like yours? What kinds of skill sets do you think in terms of what mix of IQ and EQ, tech skills? Is tech a necessity now? What sort of advice do you have for business people preparing for a career in consulting these days?
Absolutely. First of all, I believe that it is one of the, and I'm obviously a bit biased, but I think it's one of the best professions to start your career, because you get the broadest exposure possible, at least as far as I know what you get in other careers. I mean, in terms of different sectors and industries, different functional areas, you can get different geographies, you can get all that at a consulting firm. I think that's it in many ways can serve as an extended or even a supplemental MBA, if you will. And so I think that is, it still remains a very exciting place to go start your career. If I think about I'll start at the level of IQ and EQ. McKinsey is known, I think, traditionally for focusing a lot on the IQ. I mean, it goes back to the roots of when we started recruiting from business schools, and really small number of sources. By the way, we've expanded that dramatically over the last 20 years in terms of the number of schools we recruit from. And I want to just be clear that we really do look at and need both IQ and EQ. At the end of the day, we are in the profession of helping clients significantly improve their performance, and analysis is one piece of that, and maybe even a small piece of that is much more commoditized than maybe it was even 30, 40, maybe 20 years ago. But this ability to connect on a human level, leveraging this analysis and insight, but connect on a human level to get people to set and put in motion a bold aspiration, that's about how you interact with and understand people. Right? That's about the empathy and understanding how to influence and how to deal in situations that are often difficult. I mean, you're as a consultant, you're coming in often from the outside, and there's all sorts of feelings that stirs up in the folks that you are going to be working with, especially if it's a new relationship and they don't know the firm or the individuals. And so having people that really understand and have the patience and the empathy is critically important. On the IQ side, we don't look for, at least at my firm, McKinsey, we don't look for specific academic knowledge. We're totally indifferent as to whether you study this or that. What we're at the end of the day, and I'll come back to one maybe tie together with your technology point. We are looking for people who are intellectually curious, who are good at structuring problems, right? So who can say, okay, this is a question about how to make this grocery store chain more profitable. And the only way to really do that is to disaggregate it to a bunch of smaller pieces and explore the solution along the dimension of those smaller pieces. So people who can think about structuring the elements of a problem that roll up to some sort of an answer. And there's this idea of being a good conceptual problem solver, right? Being able to abstract things, general concepts and principles, and apply them across different business contexts. And that's why we don't necessarily look for a specific academic background. That being said, in the world that we are moving towards, I do think we're going to be increasingly valuing students who can do everything that I just said, who also have some familiarity with tech. Now, I'm not saying everyone needs to be able to program in, every language that's out there, but I think on balance, if you have someone who is, at the bar for IQ, EQ, if they also have a technical skill set, I think that gives them an advantage. Linking back to what I said earlier, the work that we do, whether it's strategy and corporate finance, marketing and sales, procurement operations, risk, ESG, there is, in my opinion, no world where all that is not enabled by digital and analytics over the next 5, 10, 15 years.
That's really well said, Shelley. I couldn't have stated that quite as eloquently. When people ask me for advice, I say, sort of semi-facetiously, I say, you should study philosophy because that'll help you sort of ask the right kinds of questions. It's important to be able to know what a good question is and to ask, the right kinds of questions. And I say, and then get computational skills and learn how to work with data because that's sort of the language of our future overlords. Shelley, any other advice to the students before we wrap up?
I think we covered most of it. I think the most important thing to remember as a student when you're coming out is your first job or your second job. They do matter in that they matter for a number of reasons. You want to go to a place that's going to train and develop you, right? These are formative years that are going to give you a head start professionally. So you want to pick some place that is known for investing in you, in their new employees and training them. You ideally want to go someplace that adds some credibility to your resume for future jobs, because that still matters, right? The quality of institution that you work at matters to future employers, and so I do think there's something about being thoughtful about choosing the organization that you go to. But actually, the thing that I care less about when I advise folks is whether or not you pick the absolute right industry or topic. You don't even know. That's the thing that I think most people don't, and I didn't realize at the time, you don't necessarily even know what you'll like and won't like in a professional context. Yes, there are some people that are incredibly passionate about the metaverse, and so they need to go work and do something that's going to advance AR, VR, and so forth. But I think most folks have some sort of vague idea And then even those who have more than the vague idea often find out that they don't like the thing that they thought they liked. And so I actually think you'll have time to gravitate towards the exact industry and specific content that you're passionate about. I don't think you have to solve that heavily for that in your first job. If it lines up that way, great. But go into a place that's going to develop you and go into a place that's also going to help you from a resume perspective, get to the next thing. At least personally, those are two things that are probably a bit more valuable than whether you got the exact job for the Brooklyn Nets that you wanted to get or not.
Shelley, the metaverse has come up in several conversations, and I can't help but ask you for your sort of take on it, or give us a take that you're hearing from people. What do people make of this? Because as far as I'm concerned, it's all over the place, from gaming to immersion of some sort to, I don't know. I mean, I could go on, but what's your take on it?
So I have to confess, I'm a huge fan of VR and AR technology, but I also want to be clear that I'm not sure that my active Oculus usage qualifies me truly as an expert, but I do at least have some firsthand experience, and that is sufficient for me to see the potential. And as you said, there's so many different applications, from gaming to fitness to education to social interactions, and therefore it holds so much promise in the context of some of the things we're grappling with as a society today. If I take it full circle back to this point on economic mobility, I do think that there is an opportunity to unleash the potential in the realm of education that has the chance of being a game changer. Now, this relies heavily on device affordability, on better broadband access to communities who don't have great or affordable broadband access. But if I suspend those issues for a second, I think it happens on two levels. So one is the traditional instruction in VR or AR, which is kind of like we talked about with Zoom. It's like this discussion that we're having right now. It's doing it in virtual reality, which gives just a bit more of a feeling of being in the same place. It's a bit of a blend. It's a bridge. And I think that that's interesting, but I don't think that that's necessarily groundbreaking. I love the Meta ad where they did their senior team meeting in the Oculus, and I think that speaks to the potential of it being better than being just on a screen. But I actually think the groundbreaking potential, where this idea of cognitive immersion really shines, is when we can start to design new interactive learning environments. I've got there's some of this stuff that you can do in some of these headsets today. You can go visit Cuba and go check out the old cars and lift the hood up and take some gadgets out. Imagine being able to learn about the Great Pyramids by actually visiting them in VR and actually having that cognitive experience that feels 95% like you're there, or learning physics in a dynamic virtual environment where you can manipulate things and get real world application to concepts that were hard to grasp in a textbook. I fundamentally believe that because you can design the actual experiences centrally, the scale benefits, not just in the US, but around the world, to getting those things right are incredible. I think they go far beyond the notion of just doing remote learning, which, e-learning, that's been around for a while. I'm talking about a different learning experience that has all sorts of implications for the way we retain information, the way our brain forges its understanding of new concepts. I think that is one of the most exciting developments that's out there. And the games are really fun too.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating what lies ahead. My only regret is that I'm not going to be around to see it in its heyday. I mean, how cool would it be to just sort of reach across and shake your hand right now? I mean, for starters,
That's
that
right.
would be sort of totally cool. But
That's right.
well, we'll save that for another time. We'll have to go get a drink sometime
Absolutely.
in the city. Well, Shelley, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for this conversation. Enjoyed it, learned a lot, and I hopeful that my listeners did as well. So thanks again for your time.
Thank you, Vasant, for having me. Really enjoyed it.
Thanks.